Hello there, and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb, and I'm joined by Doctors Scott Keith, Rod Rosenblatt, and Adam Francisco. Today we're going to do a Father's Day episode on the show, but before that, I wanted to remind listeners that Thinking Fellows is a production of the 1517 Podcasting Network. We produce over 8 hours of audio every week for you to go check out. It's 1517legacy.com/podcasts. Not every show is like the Thinking Fellows, and so there's great variety over there. You can find things that are more akin to a Bible study than, say, what we do, things that also suggest reading material in other areas, interaction with faith and culture, lots of different things going on there at the Podcasting Network. You can check out each of our shows, again, at the URL 1517legacy.com/podcasts. It'll also be linked in the show notes of this episode. If you've been impacted by the podcast on the network, including the Thinking Fellows in any way, please feel free to hit the contact button and share why you listen to shows on our network or what they've done. We love hearing from listeners about different shows. We get quite a few here at the Thinking Fellows, and I'm just curious what people think about the other shows on the network as well. Because I only produce this show, I don't see things over there as much, but if you do hit the contact button on the 1517 Legacy site, that'll make it my way as well. So that's pretty cool. Okay, guys, we have done a Father's Day episode every year that the Thinking Fellows has been around.
It's a tradition.
It is a tradition, isn't it? And I think there's several reasons for that. As of the second year of the show, and now in our third, everybody here is a father. So that's one big. You got 4 hosts, 4
Two
dads,
of us are grandfathers.
4 dads. 2 are grandfathers. This is
Adam's like having a heart attack over here. Not yet.
yeah. Then my dad Dr. Keith has written a book on fathers and God as Father, right? And that image that we get of a graceful father in the scriptures, and so
gracious,
and that's important to you. And then we mention and talk about just briefly sometimes on the show some of the cultural importance of fatherhood in society and in the church today as well, that is perhaps lacking or being fought against. And so
the stats are so clear and so overwhelming when you start taking surveys in prison.
Yeah, and so when we hit this every year, there's really no reason not to do this, and there's enough stories and enough things impacting us every year that this show can be unique time after time, even though it's sort of on the same day, and be a Hallmark holiday or not, at least opens up the occasion where people are thinking about fatherhood for us to kind of come in and talk about it a little bit. So I just thought today maybe we do like we have done in the past. There's some stories to talk about, perhaps. We can go back over the importance of fatherhood, and then I think, as always, go over that image of a gracious father as opposed to sort of the hammer of the household. So,
Right.
Cool. How do we want to start?
Well, I mean, for me, it's been kind of an interesting journey because since we've started, the first year we did this was the first year Being Dad was out. And it's always interesting to me, the more I have opportunities to go out and teach on the subject and on the book, my perspective on how to teach it and what to say sort of changes a little bit. And, there's different things happening in culture and honestly, some good things, right? We were just talking about Jordan Peterson a little bit and sort of his movement that sort of supports masculinity and whatnot, and some bad things too, where we in some ways get farther and farther away from this idea that it's good to be a masculine man, it's good to be a good father, it's good to have desires to be a father and to want to be a good one. And so it's always interesting to me. We do this show, and I think back on the teaching gigs on Being Dad, and I think, what questions was I asked and what's different from this year to the next. And I think one of the big things for me is that I realize the longer the book is out, how culturally displaced we are from talking about this at all. Like,
Yes.
we do this show as a tradition, and people may listen to it and say, "Oh, you did that again."
Ask anybody who's been trained to be a counselor how much time was spent in their graduate training on father, and the answer is almost always zero.
Yeah.
Zero.
Yeah. In fact, that's one of the things I found out when I wrote Being Dad is that even when the psychological studies try to categorize the role of the father in the house, he's categorized not as father, it's categorized as what number caregiver are you in this, right? Whereas mother is categorized as mother. A lot of that has to do with the fatherless rate in America, which is exceptionally high. It's like 40-ish%, so it's difficult when they're even doing the numbers to be able to count on steady father figures. And so counting in various caregivers is, becomes probably pragmatic in a way.
Yeah, it could be 6 women.
Right. Yeah, or a couple of men, have come in and out of the house or
Yes.
something like that. So that's kind of interesting. I mean, that's one of I don't know where you really wanted to go with this, Caleb, but I always think in that direction. But what I mean by culturally we're displaced from this conversation is that I noticed that even when I just went on a 6-day backpacking trip with a bunch of great men. The trip itself almost killed me, but getting to know the guys that I went on the trip with was great. And the funny thing is we're literally out, and this is what I mean by socially displaced from having this conversation. We're out in the middle of nowhere. Like, we are 50 miles from the car, haven't seen anybody in 4 days. And all of a sudden, we'll have a conversation about fatherhood. And you can hear even these guys that are very masculine men, married, good fathers, apologetically approaching the topic and whether or not they need to include their wives in the conversation and the role their wives play and how thankful they should be for their wives and all that kind of thing. And I'm fine with that. But at the same time, I think, in fact, I'm not going to call out his name, but he won't mind me telling the story. At one point, we were just sitting around after being absolutely exhausted. And one of the guys said, "We don't deserve our wives." And I said, "Stop it." He goes, "What do you mean?" I go, "Don't say that." I'm like, "I'm so tired of hearing that." He goes, "What do you mean?" I said, "If you don't deserve her, she doesn't deserve you." Or it's...
Why do we only hear one side of it?
Yeah. Why that? And he goes, "Oh, well, that's not how I mean it." I said, "Well, how do you mean it?" He goes, "Well, I mean it in Luther's explanation of the Catechism. We don't deserve any gift." I said, "Okay, that's fine. But that's not what comes across when you, as a man, sit around with a bunch of other men and just exclaim, 'You don't deserve your wife,' right?" And I get what you're trying to say. And in his case, it's probably true. But I get what you're trying to say.
It's part of me sometimes ejaculating, I'm drowning in estrogen in this culture. I'm drowning in estrogen.
Right. So that's what I mean by we're socially displaced from the conversation. We feel like even when we have it, I mean, right now, I even feel like I need to apologize. For saying that.
That's the culture we're living in.
That's the culture we're living in. And so I notice even when I go out and teach Being Dad, I mean, another great example is a couple years I went and taught Being Dad at a little pastor's conference. A bunch of pastors I knew. I mean, the goal was trying to get it into the churches to teach Being Dad. And, there's 12 pastors in the room, and 4 of them asked me if they were to hire me to come teach Being Dad in their church, was there a woman I could bring along to teach something on being a mom too?
Yep. There it is.
I think we could probably find somebody.
Oh.
But you're missing the point.
Yep.
You're missing the point.
Yep.
The point is we need this.
Yeah, it's Coles to Newcastle.
Right.
You can find women. Boy, can you find women to do that side of the story. Where can you find men who can tell that side of the story? And our kids are getting killed without it.
Right, and that's the real thing. I remember the first time I heard this was when you taught this out at the Cathedral of the Advent. Mm-hmm. When good fathers die, it's always too soon, I believe is what we call that audio. Mm-hmm. But in the Q&A, you start getting a lot of questions about what about working with your wife and I've never been brave enough to give the answer that you give, but I respect the hell out of the answer you gave, which is essentially, that's not why I'm here. And you literally say, I can't speak to that. What I can speak to is how my father influenced me, and even maybe tell a few stories about my fatherhood experience with my own children, right? But I can't speak to the other thing. And I think that's so brave, because in a lot of ways it's a reality. If you're coming out and you're teaching about being a father, you're not necessarily coming out and teaching about being a husband, right? You maybe are.
Maybe.
And it's usually part and parcel. But what you're trying to say is that culturally, and even in the church, we've lost how important it is for children to have good and gracious fathers in their lives.
Yep.
Masculine. I'll add masculine to that in
Yep.
their lives. It's gone, and it's killing us.
Yep.
It's killing us culturally, and it's killing the church.
Yep.
I don't know how we got on that track.
Why do you think
Kinda
that
got
is? Why do you
riled
think
up.
that is? That if you speak to fatherhood or masculinity, that you have to also there's this pressure.
It's the culture.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of thinking there's so much in the. Everybody talks about the narrative out there, but that narrative out there that constantly it's like it's like a broken record that women are oppressed
Yep.
and
Yep.
wage gap, all the feminist narrative, right?
24
And it's like,
hours a day.
Yeah, and
think of the time when I can remember this. It wasn't that long ago. Our girls are in trouble, and all that money headed for girls' soccer scholarship and this and that and the other. I'm not against it, except it was 180 degrees wrong diagnosis.
Yep.
It's the boys who are in trouble.
are you familiar with the book The War Against Boys?
Yeah.
Yep.
I think it's Christine Summers, a feminist, still a feminist, if I'm not mistaken, who
But she recognizes.
yeah, who argued that in the the early feminist movement, this attempt to kind of make things a bit more equitable, they went way too far, and they've
Yep.
left generations of
Yeah.
boys behind.
Yep.
I mean, there's a difference between equality and like sameness and kind of like watering things down.
Well, I think
And-
where we are now is it's retribution, and
Yeah.
that's where I think the problem is. So I think the discomfort and the societal disconnect comes from this current culture of retribution against men, right?
Mm-hmm.
So men have been abusers, men have been sort of the patriarchal dominators of society, and now it's our turn. And I think to myself, I was just talking to my wife about this the other day. I said, that's interesting, because if all of a sudden it's okay to dominate because you were dominated in a retributive fashion, there's nothing that made it wrong for us to dominate in the first
yeah,
place.
Yeah.
And that's problematic in the long run for your argument. If you're a feminist, right?
If logic matters.
if logic matters,
Yeah.
it's problematic. I mean, we've been watching a lot of comedies like on Netflix and whatnot lately, and this stuff is all over the place there.
Yep.
And it's interesting to me, but I think that's what makes men afraid, because if you're sort of constantly told that it's your time to be punished because of what your forefathers have done, and you're sort of, this is, to use the term you brought up, this quote unquote narrative that you were raised in, you will be fearful even when there's no one around, like in the middle of the Utah wilderness, to hear you. You will be fearful.
You'll be carrying it inside you.
Yeah,
That fear.
to bring it up.
Yep.
And it's this fear is killing us. I was talking to you guys before the show. I just read this book by I think Nicholas Eberstadt called Men Without Work, and he's just a political sociologist. I mean, so I wouldn't necessarily say he's agenda driven in this at all, because in a lot of ways it's the best book I've read in a long time, and it's a lot of ways it's the most boring book I've read in a long time, because he just lays out the data.
That's called Men Without Work.
Yeah. I mean, it's literally like 200 pages of data on men who, and if they are working, how long they've been out of work, how long they have been working, have they stopped looking for work, what they report as the causes for this stuff and all this type of thing. He reports in there that over 7 million men between the ages of 25 and 50 are not only 7 million are not only out of work, but do not plan on looking for work again.
Yep.
25. I mean, that's prime work years.
Yep.
And that they've become, as they report, that they've become content to be supported by their wives and family as they don't work and don't marry and don't have children and disengage from the work outside the home,
No.
disengage from life inside the home.
Yep.
If you're concerned about the church, certainly disengage from life within the church.
Yep.
Completely disengaged.
Yeah, you take that central thing away from a man, at least an American man, and you've eviscerated him.
Right. And then people ask why, and he even reports. Well, he reports as one of the problems of the very high fatherless rate. Mm-hmm. There's nothing there to see.
Yep.
Yeah, I was interested. I was listening to something the other day, and talking about how one of the things in culture is that we need women businessmen so that little girls have somebody to look up to. We need women scientists so we have little girls who have somebody to look up to. But if you said that for boys, we need male entrepreneurs, we need male engineers and things so that little boys have something to look up to. You'll get told, well, why can't they look up to the women in those positions?
Yep.
Right?
I say when I teach being dad, one of the things I start out with is that we need, if we want our little boys to grow up to be good men, good, gracious, kind, whatever adjective you want to attach to that, men, they have to have these men in their lives
Early.
To aspire to be that thing, or they won't.
Yep.
And then if you want to connect it to the church, one of the things I say as I teach is I come in and look at the pastors and just the people in the church, and I say, if you are somebody who brings your children regularly to church, right, and every Sunday they sit in these pews or in Sunday school, and hopefully if they're hearing the gospel in their church, they hear about a God a man who we call Father, that loved them so much that he sent another man who we call his Son to die for them, that when they believe on him, they might have eternal life. Mm-hmm. And we ask him to believe that. And then we don't think it's important at all to make sure that they have in their lives men who they might see as loving, gracious, kind, strong, sacrificial for them.
Yep.
When all of the data, the pagan data, tells us that if they do have those men in their lives, they are much more likely to believe the message that they hear on Sunday morning about their redemption on account of Christ for the rest of their lives.
Yep.
Not just while they're in our home, but when they go to college, when they grow up, when they have families, when they raise their own families.
And when we're there without it, they're vulnerable.
They're hugely vulnerable.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a big problem, and there's not necessarily like a silver bullet solution, which is what we run into a lot on the show lately, is especially as some of the episodes that we do tend to cross with some of the cultural problems that we see, which I think is kind of inevitable when we're dealing with things inside the church, because it doesn't stay inside the church, right, if we're doing it right.
Well, we all acknowledge the cutting edge at 1517 is the gospel explicated, in sound biblical ways. The message of salvation, basic verses. But in wanting our children to believe the gospel, this is a key factor.
Yeah.
It just is, and Scott has done the homework on it. If we want our children to continue to believe the gospel when they leave home, the strongest thing we can do for them is to have had a history with a Father who is gracious.
Right.
Over and over.
That message of the gospel is heard, through the direct proclamation of the message of Christ.
Yep.
And heard in actually being forgiven.
Yep.
By fathers and other male figures in their lives. I mean, the number of people that report how hard it is to believe in creedal Christianity because of their negative experiences with men in their lives is phenomenal. I mean, it's huge. It's huge.
I think it's about time for our break, so we're going to go ahead and do that now, and then we'll come back with maybe some more positivity in the second half of this episode. Hello there, and welcome to our break today. Let's follow tradition and give the ad segment here to Dr. Keith's book, Being Dad, Father as a Picture of God's Grace. It's actually been a long time since we've done this on the show, and we used to plug this all the time, shamelessly, as we do. And it's just appropriate to tell listeners where they can buy the book and maybe go over some of the content. We have lots of new listeners from the last time that we did this. So.
Oh, okay.
So Being Dad, Father is a Picture of God's Grace is Dr. Keith's kind of like premiere book at 1517. It's the best-selling book in our catalog by far.
Oh, stop it.
And it's available at shop.1517legacy.com and on Amazon. It's the second edition now, right, with a new cover. All the editions are hardcover, but they're sold at a softcover price.
Right.
So that's pretty cool.
Yep.
And what's it about?
Well, I mean, the long short story is that there are quite a few lessons that I learned from Rod when I was a student that had to do with being a dad, and they were taught through theology classes and philosophy classes and things like that. And then later on, as I got to know him better, just through example. And then, as we already referenced on the show earlier, at one point, I think probably about a decade ago, Rod did this lecture at the Cathedral of the Holy Advent in Birmingham, Alabama, called When Good Fathers Die, It's Always Too Soon, where he sort of took some of these things that he said offhandedly in class, and if you ever had Rod for class, sort of just when he kind of got on one of his roles, and he, I guess for lack of a better word, I'd say systematized it into an hour-and-a-half lecture or something like that, and then added a bunch of stories to it. And specifically, I'd say, Caleb, when you were growing up, for various reasons, that lecture was really important to me to sort of put all the pieces together on what to say to you and to your mom and to at times when there was, conflict and problems and whatnot. And so when I came back to Concordia, I talked to Rod about writing the book, and he instead of saying, yeah, I'll write a book, said, hey, yeah, you should write it, and I'll give you all my research. And so he did that, and then I spent about another year or so researching and wrote the book Being Dad, which is basically based on the parable of the prodigal son. And the picture that we get there of, primarily, of course, that parable is about our redemption and how the Father deals with us, we prodigals, and we older sons as well, and how he deals with us. But it's also one of the clearest pictures we get from the mouth of Christ about what a good earthly father might look like. And that picture, and so the rest of the book, after sort of just the exegesis of the prodigal son, the rest of the book is sort of reckoning with this picture that Christ gives, which is a completely opposite picture of the one we would create ourselves if we were trying to create a picture of what
we'd do it like the Navy.
Yeah, a good dad looks like. And ours would all be, the dad who rightly punishes the prodigal son for leaving and for deals harshly with the older son for questioning his authority and all these things.
Yep.
We'd produce a picture of a dad who was completely law-bound, not a dad that was ruled by graciousness and a character of the gospel and forgiveness. We'd create the exact opposite picture. So the rest of the book is sort of tearing that apart and sort of saying, listen, the picture that Christ gave us is completely opposite what we think it should be. And maybe that means that our reaction to our children ought to be the opposite of even what the church culture tells us it should be. Maybe we ought not be either useless or removed or the bigger biceps and louder voice to back up mom. Maybe we ought to be this other picture, or at least try to be this other picture, which is more gracious, kind, and forgiving than we could ever actually be. But sort of set that as the picture, as the goal. And certainly then take that forgiveness that we talk about, the book talks about giving to the children and ask for it ourselves when we fail in that. And then what people tell me, one of the things they like best about the book is that every chapter has a story in it written by somebody else. And so the chapters are very short, and they're sort of bookended by a story that somebody else wrote that illustrates what I'm trying to teach in the chapter.
What a convenient way to hit your 100 pages.
Yeah, wow. And then the last chapter is all just stories from other people.
Yeah, it's really fun.
About their fathers. So it was fun to write. It was fun to sort of re-edit last year for the second edition. It's been fun to teach on. And what's been very good for me is just the number of emails that I've received through the years of how the book has helped people.
Good.
So it's helped them sort of take what their previous view was of their role as a man and as a father and sort of turned it on its head. I was actually told this year that somebody used a line out of that book to propose to his wife.
I think I
don't know
heard
what
that.
the line was.
Yeah, I think I
I
heard
was
that.
trying to think of it.
Yeah.
What was it?
I don't know. There's a lot of lines in there.
Well, the basis in the prodigal son and the exegesis of just that one in Scripture confronts 90% of what's going on in our culture.
Yeah.
It really does.
It's truly an amazing parable. And it really does fly in the face of everything the culture tells us about being a man and a father, and everything, too, I'm sorry to say, the church tells us.
Yep,
about
often.
being a man and a father.
Yeah, in our own, well, you can cut this if you want to. In our own church, if you grew up German, that was rough on your picture of father, because finally Alice Miller from Europe, Switzerland, who teaches every year by invitation at UCLA, they fly her in. For Your Own Good is the name of the book, and what she's the expert in the world on the German family, and what she shows in there and defends is that it's a very, 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 very well hidden matriarchy.
Yeah.
And if you've got a matriarchy, Spanish, Arab, you name it, if it's a matriarchy, then the sons are set against one another from birth onwards. They're competitors for mom. Who's going to be closest to mom? And everything goes askew. And then the connection with our clergy and mom and church is direct.
Yeah.
And it's not good.
Yeah. And you see, it's even funny in the parable of the prodigal son. You don't. There's no mention of mother in there, of course, but you see, from as the story progresses, that the sons are set against each other.
Yeah.
And there's good reason for it in the parable, of course, but you see that's the reality in their life. And I was going to say where the church, and I'm not even going to say our own church goes wrong with this, but the church kind of generally goes wrong with this, is even when the church attempts to sort of say, hey, it's really important for fathers to be in the lives of their children and to support that through groups or sermons and Bible studies, curricular material or whatever. 9 times out of 10, it's going to be, spare the rod, spoil the child stuff.
Yep.
It's not going to be, you have a particular calling in your home, and that calling is to be the mouthpiece of forgiveness.
Yep.
It's not that. That's what being dad does, that I think if it does hit the mark anywhere, it hits the mark there, especially just because of what a countercultural message it is for men to receive, to say, hey, your natural inclination, to say, calm down, it's going to be okay. We'll get this worked out. And to forgive, your natural inclination to do that is not wrong. It's right.
Yep.
And we ought not suppress it by telling you to just come in and be a bully, really, to your family and to your children.
Pretty cool. Yeah. Again, that's available at shop.1517legacy.com. It's also available on Amazon. Either way, you'll get the book fast, cheap shipping, or free if you have Amazon Prime and the like. So please go ahead and check that out. So maybe to kind of round out the latter half of this episode, we can pick up maybe a cue out of being dad and do some stories of fatherhood. And one of the ones that's always requested from listeners, I think since we did this that first year, is Rod telling stories about his father. And so maybe you could share one on the show today.
One? Okay. Some of these I've told before. What I'll do is give you an RTF of the ones that I just collected to help my own memory. out of the blue one time, I was at my fraternity house at the University of Washington. Out of the blue, I get a phone call from my dad. He said to me, "Rod, did you once say to me that you'd like a sports car?" I answered, "Dad, I'd love a sports car." And he said, "Well, I just saved a young man's life in surgery. And he told me that he'd bought one and that he hates the thing and he wants to dump it. I think you need that car." And I said, "Well, what is it, Dad?" He said, "It's an MGA convertible. Onyx Black."
Onyx Black.
Yeah. And I was driving it within 7 days.
Wow.
One of the first drives I took it on was up Hurricane Ridge, Western Washington. It was nighttime, and it wasn't long before I saw a flashing light behind me. And the state trooper was benevolent. He said to me, "You know, son, you weren't really breaking the speed laws. But when it says 55 miles an hour, you don't have to take all the curves at 55. I was just learning how to use it with rack and pinion steering and being that low center of gravity where you could do it. During my senior year of high school, a few friends and I would regularly plan to study together at my house in the evening. It would always last just a while, and we'd end up playing poker instead. My dad would fix iced Coca-Cola and buttered popcorn and bring both down to us all. We'd be, quote, studying in the basement. And then he'd, quote, notice we were playing poker. He would sit down for a few hands, lose $50, and then go upstairs again.
Tell the one about crashing your car when you're on your scavenger hunt. I love to sort of explain that one when people get so upset about it.
They get angry.
Yeah.
I belonged to a high school fraternity. And one of the things when you were upper class was that the pledges would go hide, not come to the meeting, and then leave clues as to where they were, and you had to try and find them. And we were drinking. I was driving my old straight 8 Buick that I'd inherited. And at one point, I came out of a blind corner. Nighttime in Seattle, Tacoma can be really dark. And I came very slowly out of a blind corner. And by the time I could see that there was a car coming in my lane, it was already too late because the hood was so long. And a 57 Ford hit me, and my Buick collapsed on the road, and he lost a headlight ring. And I phoned my dad, and I said, "I've just crashed the car, Dad." He said, "My gosh, are you okay?" I said, "I'm okay. I'm with 4 or 5 other guys, and we're all drunk." He said, "Stay where you are. I'll get the car towed, and I'll be there to pick you all up and take everybody home." So he came and got us, took all these other guys home, and we went to our house. And the first thing he said when he got into the house was to tell my mother to leave us alone. Very wise. So we go into a back room, and he's got his arm around me. I'm crying like crazy. And he said, "What are you feeling?" I said, "I'm shaking." He said, "That's shock. It's okay. It's okay." And after I calmed down a little bit, he said, "You know what I think you need? I think you need a new car. Why don't you go looking to see what you can find, and I'll take lunch hours, and we'll get a car for you to replace the old Buick."
Man, people hate it when you tell that story.
They do. A lot of them do.
They hear it and they hear, "My gosh, your father's rewarding you for being drunk and getting in an accident and almost killing 4 of your friends." That's what they hear. What they don't hear, which is interesting, is the offense of the gospel.
Yeah.
We had a 15-17 staff meeting today, and Mark Jasa, who's our sort of resident evangelist, doesn't always come. But your son Ted was, when Mark walked in, your son Ted was talking about the offense of the gospel.
Uh-huh.
And Mark just sort of, if you know Mark, you know that he just does this. He sort of just like blurts in. Mm-hmm. He's like, "The gospel is supposed to be outrageously offensive, and that's supposed to be your reaction to it. And if you're not outrageously offended, you haven't heard the gospel." And I thought, people need to connect the dots when they hear the story of that's why that story, can I say pisses them off, is because
I never got what I deserved.
you didn't get what you deserved. I mean, you deserved punishment. You deserved not to have a car again until you could buy your own. You probably
Yep.
deserved
All
a
of it.
DUI ticket. You deserved all of that,
Yep.
and you didn't get it. Instead, you got forgiveness. And what's worse is you got rewarded.
Yeah. A new car.
And I often back that story up with the one that I have in the book from Jim Monroe, which is, kind of similar, but the one where he's at his house and he's arguing with his little sister when he's a kid, and he gets sick of her, arguing in his faces, and he punches her in the stomach. And then she starts to cry so loud that he's worried his mom's going to hear it, so he wants to get her to shut up. And so he sees a spray can on the table,
Yep.
and he picks it up and puts it in her mouth and sprays it in her mouth. Come to find out, it's DDT, which is an incredibly poisonous chemical.
Oh.
And he says, just then my mom walks in and doesn't say a word to me, scoops my sister up, runs outside, flags down a car. This is in the 50s, okay, in like Ohio or something like that. Takes her to the hospital, and he sits in his room and he waits.
Yep.
And he's waiting for his dad. He's waiting for what he says he knows would be the literal second coming of Jesus Christ in his bedroom at that moment.
Yep.
And after about a half an hour, he hears the footsteps coming up the stairs, and he's mortified, he's terrified, and he's worried about his sister, of course, right? And he says his dad opens the door and just looks at him and sees the hurt, sees the fear, sees the despair on his face. And instead of giving him what he deserved, which was probably back then especially, put over his knee, he kneels down and opens up his arms. And he runs into his dad's arms like a shot. And Jim says that he can still feel those arms to this day. And he says they're the arms with nail-scarred hands.
Yeah.
And that's, again, he didn't get what he deserved, and he gets a hug instead of a spanking. And he says that forgiveness from that day on, convinced him
Yep.
that an outrageous forgiveness for a despicable deed
Yep.
and for being a despicable person
Yep.
in that moment
Yep.
is possible.
Yeah.
That's what we should celebrate on Father's Day.
Yeah.
Because that's all that matters. If your kids understand that about God the Father,
Yep.
they'll be a Christian for the rest of their lives.
Yep.
If they understand that about you, it'll be easier for them to understand that about God the Father in Christ.
Absolutely.
That's what we should celebrate on Father's Day.
Yep.
Very cool. Thank you for sharing those once again.
I'll give you this little memory thing if people want to take it.
Or they can buy the book. It's all in the book.
Yeah, you can buy Being Dad and get some of these stories and more from all sorts of fathers and children. It really doesn't matter to me that that you tell those same stories every year, because it just doesn't get old, and it's something that people can and should hear time and time again. Is the impact that graciousness has on one's life.
Yeah, forgiveness.
Let me tell one more.
You go for it.
I found out later on, I wasn't cognizant of this when I was very young, but I learned from somebody else that every single semester my dad would drive over to the University of Washington Medical School, and he would ask what seniors were going to have to drop out for lack of money. Then he would pay their whole amount for their final year of medical school on the one condition that those students were never told where the money came from.
We will meet your dad in paradise, Rod.
Yep.
And it'll be wonderful.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Thinking Fellows. We hope that you enjoyed it. It's when we do this episode, it's a little different than the standard, like systematic or historical episode. But it's a lot of fun for us to get to kind of break loose into something that we care about deeply.
Let me add one more ad to Scott's book.
Yeah.
Again, I encourage everybody who's in a parish, especially a Lutheran one, encourage the parish to buy Dr. Montgomery's audio series on CD, Sensible Christianity, the Defense of the Gospel.
Well, that's
So-
actually MP3 now. That
Oh,
the way we sell
Well,
it.
I want it so people can check it out from the church
We
library.
can handle that too.
Yeah.
And maybe even if you're really pleased with that, and I'd be amazed if you weren't, consider his second series, The Defense of the Gospel Through the Ages. That's a history of it. How the gospel has been successfully defended and by whom and how. The Defense of the Gospel Through the Ages. Take that as the best recommend I can give.
Great. Today is actually a Tuesday afternoon, and listeners who subscribe to the show, you get Thinking Fellows episodes directly to your phone Tuesdays. That's when we drop shows, and this is just a reminder to if you haven't subscribed to the show and you have to remember to go look for it, whether on iTunes or on our website or the 1517 podcasting page. That instead you can subscribe and get it directly to your phone on Tuesdays. It's kind of cool. I'm sitting here. I've been watching the downloads, and I can refresh the page every 30 seconds. There's about another 15 or 20 downloads today, which was really fun to watch on Tuesdays. As people, you can see as people, get their phones, updated and the like. It's also really cool to see the map of where everybody's listening, and so just give people a picture. We've had about 50,000 interactions in the United States in the last 2 months, about 2,000 in Canada. We have listeners, 500 in Germany, 300 in Norway, 1,000 in the United Kingdom, and things like that.
crazy.
Saudi Arabia and Egypt.
300 in Norway.
It's just really fun.
How many in Saudi Arabia? I'm just kind of curious.
25 people looking out for you, Dr. Francisco.
Awesome.
Just all over the world. Even places that are hard to get, like American content, like China and things like that. We have
Awesome. That's
we
great.
have downloads. So thank you to everybody who has listened to this show wherever you are in the world. And if you are one of our international listeners, it would be kind of fun to hear from you. We know a handful of you that we've met personally in Norway and Germany, in the United Kingdom. But if you just want to say, "Hey, I'm one of those listeners from wherever in the world,"
We're looking for the one in Iceland, aren't we?
we are looking for the one in Iceland, and so is some pastor who keeps emailing me asking if we found him yet.
Yeah.
So yes, if you're the listener in Iceland, please
Give us a
give
note.
us a ring. All right, we'll talk to you next week. Alrighty, bye.
Bye.